Thank you all for being here today with me. This is a very exciting time in human history, and that's because we're on the verge of a new digital age. Every once in a while, a new technology emerges that transforms the social order and the economic state of affairs in profound and unexpected ways. The invention of the steam engine introduced the industrial era. The invention of the printing press transformed how we consume information. And we are on the brink of this very interesting period where there's not just one technology, but 6 or maybe even 7, each of which has the potential to have a very profound impact on the world and on our daily lives. We hear about things like machine learning, about the Internet of Things, about autonomous vehicles, new sources of energy, technology that is embedded into our very bodies. But there's this one technology in particular that I think is going to have a more profound impact than any other. It may actually help to animate many of these. And it is the technology behind cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and it's called blockchain. I've been at this for several years. I wrote a book called Blockchain Revolution, which has been translated into over 21 languages, and launched a think tank called the Blockchain Research Institute, funded by many of the world's leading companies and governments. And in that period of time that we've been researching this subject, I've come to the conclusion that this technology represents nothing short of a new era of the internet, and is going to have as great, if not a greater impact on the world than the internet had. So let me explain what I mean by that. When we use the internet today to send and move information, we're not actually sending an original unique thing. We're sending a version or a copy. So if I send an email to someone, I can send the same email to someone else. If I write something on Wikipedia or Twitter, it's available for all to see. I can launch a website that anyone can access. So the internet is this profoundly powerful tool. It's kind of like we all have our own printing press for information. It democratized access to information and democratized publishing. Now everyone can be their own citizen journalist, their own citizen scientist, for better or for worse, but it has had a profound impact on the world. Except when it comes to things that have value, money or assets, being able to create copies and send duplicates is actually not such a good thing. So if instead of an email, I owe John $20 for something, and I sent it to him, it's really important that he knows that he has the only version of that $20, that I can't send the same $20 to someone else. Because if I can copy money or assets the way I can copy information, then that money and those assets are worthless, right? And this is a very specific computer science problem that very intelligent people have been trying to resolve for many years. It's called the double spend problem. How do you ensure that when you move something of value digitally, that you're not able to send the same thing again, that you're not able to copy that money the way you can with information on the internet? And because this has had been such a difficult problem to solve, we've had to rely on intermediaries, middlemen, to sit in the center of all commerce online, much as they do in the analog world or in the pre-internet world. Now, many of these intermediaries would be familiar to you. They are, of course, large banks, brokerages, and other financial services companies. But increasingly, we're seeing large digital conglomerates, technology platforms, social media companies acting as the middlemen for commerce online. Now, these entities perform some essential roles in the economy. They establish the identity of parties. Who's the buyer, who's the seller, who's the sender or receiver. They perform all the business logic, clearing, settling, record keeping, contracting, all of those steps that are required to make commerce work. And the final thing they do is they establish trust between parties. And for doing so, they get compensated. Now, overall, these middlemen have done a pretty decent job, but they have some very specific limitations. They're all centralized companies or government entities, which makes them vulnerable to hacking or to attack. They extract fees and slow things down. In the case of sending money overseas, it still takes days, sometimes even weeks, to settle transactions between two parties. They capture all this data about us, our daily lives. All this information that goes into ourselves online is not owned by us, it's owned by the services and the companies that we interact with. And all of these different problems, I think, can be solved, potentially, with a new technology platform for commerce online. This is known as the evolution of the web. So the first era of the web was the Internet of Information. The first version of the web is known as Web 1, which is known colloquially in this industry as the read web. The information that is available online is static. It's one-directional. So you go onto a website and you're able to access information, but you can't interact with it. You can't communicate. You can't use it as a tool for collaboration. This is the dot-com era, the internet and the web of the 1990s. In the early 2000s, after the dot-com crash, there necessitated a change for a new version of the web, and we got introduced to this new version of the web called Web 2, where the web went from a one-way medium for communication or for consumption of information to a tool that we can use to collaborate. So all of a sudden, we were able to post information online. We're able to create communities. We're able to build value collectively on the internet. And this had a very profound impact on the world. Except what ended up happening is a lot of the value created by individuals and created by communities online in Web 2 was captured by large companies, social media giants, who turned the web's native industry basically into advertising. So the role was to capture as much data as possible about people online and to use that information to target ads towards them. So now we're entering this new era known as Web 3. And Web 3 is the internet enabled by blockchain. So what I'm going to talk about today is 6 transformations and the way in which Web 3 is going to change our world. We're going to start at the most elemental, the most foundational, the concept of assets. And from there, we're going to expand outwards and look at different levels of transformation. So let's start first with assets. So over the course of economic history, assets have gone through 2 big transformations. The first is that they become more democratized, and the second is that they've become more abstracted. So what does that mean exactly? Well, in the Middle Ages, during feudal times, the church, the king, and a handful of landowners owned all of the land. And land was basically the dominant asset class of the agrarian age, of the feudal economy. As capitalism began to emerge and as industrial processes began to emerge, we saw that assets started to become more democratized. So all of a sudden, instead of just agrarian landowners, you had capitalists, business owners, and shareholders, stockholders, who could participate at a very limited level in a nascent sort of capital market for assets. And in the process, what happened was assets became more abstracted. So in the agrarian age, land was really the only asset class that mattered. Yes, there was money, gold, and specie, but most people in medieval times would have gone their entire lives without ever seeing money, right? They would have only seen land. During the industrial age, money became preeminent, and with it, a whole new asset class of stocks, of bonds, of titles, of deeds, of banknotes, of letters of credit, and so forth. And in the digital economy, we've seen assets become even more democratized. So over the course of the 20th century, we saw capital as we know it, mostly when you think about stocks and bonds and other capital assets, going from being controlled by a handful of small, highly affluent stockholders to being held much more widely. The invention of the discount brokerage, the mutual fund, the ETF, the zero-fee trading account lowered the barriers for people to be able to own assets in a way that was not possible before. So what I'm describing to you today is very much an evolution of a process that's been going on for many decades. You know, today, the largest shareholders of American companies are not the Vanderbilts of the world or the Elon Musks of the world. They are index funds held, broadly speaking, by middle-class people, or they're pension funds whose members are working-class people in many different industries. So the third part of this transformation is the digitization of assets. So what we are experiencing now is a new medium for value. If the internet was the first digital medium for information, then blockchain is the first digital medium for value. It is a way to represent any kind of asset in the economy, both existing assets, titles and deeds, stocks and bonds, and other traditional financial assets, but also new kinds of assets that we haven't imagined. It's a way to render them or to represent them digitally. A very useful analogy to use is of a container. So if you think of a website, it's sort of like a container. It's a tabula rasa, blank sheet. And on it, you can put any kind of information. A website can be an encyclopedia. It can be where you get the weather. It can where you get sports. It can be a storefront. It can be how you access your healthcare services and so forth. A token is a container for value. Website, container for information, token, container for value. So we hear about crypto, right? Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is a very large asset. It's worth $400 billion. It's widely held by millions of people all around the world. It's used as a store of value and a unit of account. It's a very important innovation. But Bitcoin is the first, not the last or the only example of digital assets being used to represent value. In fact, from our research, we've identified at least 9 different types of digital assets. Bitcoin is a version of a cryptocurrency, but it is one of 9 different kinds of digital assets. Unfortunately, today, I don't have time to walk through every single one of these, but I'll bet you, just looking at this list, that you see some things that are familiar. You've probably heard of a central bank digital currency, right? The idea that this technology is a powerful way to represent value. Perhaps the token can be a container for a sovereign currency, right? Perhaps the token can be a way to represent a US dollar or to represent a euro. And in fact, we're already seeing that play out today in another category called stablecoins. Stablecoins are digital assets that are backed by fiat currency held in reserve somewhere. They are used very widely around the world today as a medium of exchange and have a market capitalization of around $150 billion. But what's important to understand about this slide is that in 1993, I could have developed a taxonomy for websites. You know, a website is an encyclopedia. It can be a place to get the news. It can be how you access your calendar. But over time, such a taxonomy would be sort of ridiculous because a website can be an infinite number of variations. You can do anything with a website. You can do anything with a token or digital good. The second transformation from assets is to individuals, to ourselves. So in the old world, you as an internet user have no rights. You have no rights over your own data. You have no rights over your own digital property. There's a virtual you out there, but it's not owned by you. It's owned by Facebook and Google and Microsoft and Amazon and Apple and your government and your healthcare provider and all these different entities. And it turns out that the virtual you knows you better than you know you. You don't know where you went or what you ate or what you said or how much your Uber cost exactly 2 years ago today. But the virtual you does. So this is a form of digital feudalism. You create all this data, it gets monetized by someone else, but you have no property rights to it. So in a Web3 world, instead of a version of digital feudalism, we have a form of self-sovereign identity where you can control not only your digital goods, your assets, but also your identity, the things that make you you. And you decide how it gets used, and you decide how it gets monetized, and it puts control and power in the hands of the individual. The third transformation is to organizations or the enterprise. We're here at the World Government Summit. I think a lot of people would like to think of how technologies can change the nature of government. I can tell you for certain, that Web3 digital assets will transform government and the organization known as the firm. So there's a theory of the firm that says the reason that companies exist is transaction costs. So long as it's cheaper to do things inside the boundaries of a firm, then companies will grow. So in the olden days, in the industrial age, Henry Ford did everything, right? The Ford Motor Company didn't just make cars. It had a timber mill, it had a rubber plantation, it had oil refinery. It was cheaper at that time to do things inside of a company than in an open market. So what happened during the 20th century is that transaction costs went down. So all of a sudden, you didn't have to do everything inside of the company. You could focus on what you do best and outsource the rest. And so companies became more like business webs, where they focused on the areas where they were expert, and then they let other entities, subcontractors, partners, and so forth, help manage the rest of the value creation that happened. But if you look at the firm today, Pick any company, whether it's Apple, the biggest corporation in the world, biggest private company in the world, publicly traded. It does still look fundamentally similar to the way it looked before. It still has a management team, it still has stockholders, it still has a supply chain and product set, and so forth. What Web3 is enabling is new forms of organizational capability. So instead of issuing shares to raise money to start a business, which is the conventional way that a company might begin, you're able to issue a token which represents ownership in a new digitally native organization. But that token might actually also be useful as a product inside of the company. I wish I had more time to explain this in detail, but the term for this is known as a decentralized autonomous organization, or DAO. And a DAO is basically like the native organization of most projects in Web3. There are DAOs today that collectively control billions of dollars of value in the economy. Blockchain is going to have an impact on every single industry, everything from supply chains to manufacturing, healthcare, and retail. Financial services is where it is having the greatest impact today. Financial services as an industry is, I think, very bewildering to a lot of people. You know, it's more than any one industry, it is the cardiovascular system of our economy. You know, its leaders are known as the masters of the universe, and so forth. But fundamentally, it does 9 things in the economy. It gives us a way to prove our identity, to get access to financial services, a way to store value, a way to move value, a way to access credit, a way to get access to growth capital, a way to exchange assets, to insure against risk, to organize financial information, and to analyze what is happening in the marketplace. Those functions of the financial industry are being transformed by this technology. So all of these different functions, from storing, moving, lending, and so forth, can be done by software. You don't need organizations and companies sitting in the center of transactions, extracting fees in order to do many of the functions. In the same way that the internet transformed information industries like media and publishing, broadcast, film, TV, and so forth, Web3 and blockchain will transform value-based industries, financial services chief among them. The final transformation here is to what I would call the human experience. So the metaverse is this much hyped term, and I think it's an amorphous term. A lot of people don't know how exactly to define it, but everyone agrees that it's going to have a significant economic input or output or value. So by some estimates, Citibank estimates that $10 trillion will be created in the metaverse. Well, what is the metaverse? Facebook and others would have you believe that it's a virtual environment that is owned by that company, and they control how you access it and how you experience it. I'd like to think of it slightly differently. If the first era of the web was primarily accessed via PCs and websites, and the second era of the web was primarily accessed via smartphones and applications, then the third era of the web, Web3, what I'm describing, may ultimately have a new interface and may be accessed mostly by augmented reality, virtual reality, and so forth. But if we end up only accessing it through Facebook and other companies, then we're not changing the economic model, we're just perpetuating the old economic model. So what we need is a way to represent our digital identities and to have digital property rights online. And the only way to make that happen is with blockchain. The final subject is on reinventing money. I mentioned earlier CBDCs and stablecoins. There are 3 competing visions for what the future of money is going to look like. The first would be what I would call community-based currencies, like Bitcoin. Bitcoin began as a computer science experiment, something that hobbyists found very interesting, but has morphed into something much larger and more significant. It has a market value, as I mentioned, of hundreds of billions of dollars, but it is also very volatile. The network itself is slow. Much like gold, it is somewhat limited in its utility. So this has led some innovators to come up with some alternative framings for what money could look like. By the way, all of these visions agree that blockchain is foundational to how all of these work. Governments and central banks would have you say the killer app for blockchain is not Bitcoin or the metaverse or any of these other things. It's actually central bank digital currencies. Leave it to us. we have a way to do this. Now, there are many potential benefits to CBDCs, as they're called. They could reduce friction in the economy. They could improve financial access for those who don't have a bank account. But they would also increase government oversight into people's economic lives, also known as surveillance. And that's something that we need to consider very carefully before moving ahead. And then the third vision are what are known as stablecoins. Stablecoins are privately issued money that is backed by fiat currencies. The biggest examples of this would be USDC and USDT. USDC, I think, is the winning framing of how this will work. They're a US domiciled business with reserves that are held in a US financial institution. They are regulated in the United States. Everyone can see what their reserves are. And USDC today is accessible to everybody who has a digital asset wallet, which is estimated to be upwards of 400 million people worldwide. And it's possible that this will help to improve the metabolism of commerce online. It's also possible that it will lead to what's known as dollarization, where people all around the world having easy access to a cheap and affordable digital US dollar will start to substitute it out for their local currency. And that could have a destabilizing effect on many governments in the world. So I'll leave you with this final slide. This is what's known as a red flag law. So in the olden days, in the 19th century, as the automobile was being introduced, there was an outcry that these things needed to be regulated and there needed to be new policies put in place. So in Victorian England, they introduced this thing called red flag laws, which basically said that every automobile needed two operators. It needed a driver and it needed someone walking in front waving a red flag. And the reason for this was that the idea was basically you needed the red flag to warn horses that this thing was coming along, because otherwise the horses would be very startled by it and might, panic. Now, of course, if you think of the benefit of an automobile, having someone walk in front of it waving a red flag sort of negates the usefulness of the automobile. You want to be able to be free, have freedom and move quickly and go where you want. Being able to only go as quick as a pedestrian doesn't help. So we need regulation, of course, for any new technology that comes along. And we need to come up with policies that help to support innovation. But we can't move too quickly, or we might create the unintended consequences of things like red flag laws. Dubai, globally, is a leader in this area. This government understands that, yes, we need regulation, but we also can help create conditions for entrepreneurship to succeed. We can attract talent, we can attract capital, we can make ourselves a beacon for innovators worldwide. The first era of the internet was dominated by the United States because all of the internet connections, all of the VC capital, and all of the big tech companies were in the US. Today, that's not the case. Technology is way more distributed than it ever has been, and it's everyone's opportunity to be a leader in this area. So I will leave it at that and say thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Yeah.